Senate, there could be a couple different big storylines to come out of this. One has already emerged, and that is how, in a moment where you could expect voters to be fatigued, they are as fired up as ever. They are setting records with their early vote. We'll see how many show up to the polls today. Let's go to ABC's campaign embed, Layli Ibsa, who's been stationed in Georgia 4 months. Layli, I bet you thought you were coming home on election day in November. Have you just had to stay there? Are you still talking to these voters?
I was anticipating it. I've had to stay here for the extra month that Georgia went from the general election cycle to the runoff cycle. First, talking to voters are really excited to vote.
Have you voted already?
I have not. I'm voting tomorrow. Rain, sleet, snow, shine. I will be there tomorrow in full force voting.
I think what we see from the long early voting lines is that even though that control of the Senate is already decided, Georgians care about Georgia and they care about who is going to represent them.
I think Mr. Herschel Walker is an excellent man for the job.
Raphael Warnock will be best suitable to represent us.
So even though it's another runoff election, they have to go back to the polls, wait in really long lines in order to ensure that the candidate that they want will have the best chance to making into office.
What are the vibes between these campaigns then? How have they seen this kind of final stretch?
On the candidate side, it's two different vibes.
We are going to finish first one more time. Are you ready?
Senator Warnock has had an all-out sprint during this runoff cycle.
Vote like health care depends on it. Vote like a woman's right to choose depends on it, because it does. You ought to vote like it's an emergency.
Multiple campaign stops pretty much every single day of this runoff cycle.
I love you all, and we're going to win this election and get Georgia back together.
On the other side, Herschel Walker has been notably absent from the campaign trail for much of this time. During the Thanksgiving holiday, he spent 5 days off the campaign trail. And remember, this is a 28-day runoff cycle. So taking 5 days off during the runoff cycle is a really huge chunk of time.
I think a vote for Warnock is a vote for these failed policies. A vote for me is a better coming.
Is there a way to quantify who has the advantage at this moment? Do we get a sense from the polls or the models?
Polling is showing that this race is still going to be very tight. But right now, it is trending in favor of Senator Warnock. I mean, if you go back into the general election cycle, Senator Warnock ended up on top. He finished less than 1% ahead of Herschel Walker. But that was with a libertarian candidate, right? And so what Senator Warnock has really done in this runoff cycle is try to appeal to those voters.
I'm running for re-election not because I'm in love with politics. I'm in love with change. I tolerate politics so that I can work on behalf of the state that I love.
If you're talking about the difference between the Republican Herschel Walker and the Democrat Senator Warnock, the third-party candidates most likely trend in Senator Warnock's favor.
The first Tuesday in December, we're going to run over Raphael Warnock and send Herschel Walker to the United States Senate.
But one thing that Herschel Walker does have is Governor Brian Kemp.
We're going to keep our state moving in the right direction because we stopped Stacey and saved Georgia, and I want to thank y'all for that.
He held a campaign rally with Herschel Walker. He filmed a campaign ad for him.
Herschel Walker will vote for Georgia, not be another rubber stamp for Joe Biden. That's why I'm backing Herschel.
Governor Brian Kemp has also turned over his grassroots turnout operation to the Senate Leadership Fund ahead of this Senate runoff to really help Herschel Walker.
We need someone in Washington that's going to row the boat with Governor Kemp, and we got to row in the same direction. What he's been doing, rowing against Governor Kemp. So that's the reason why in Washington on the federal level, we're not getting anything done.
The voters that I've talked to that split their ticket, they voted for Governor Kemp and Senator Warnock in the general cycle, aren't really moved by the fact that Governor Kemp just filmed an ad and held a campaign stop with Herschel Walker. They want to see more from Herschel Walker. They wanted to hear more about his policies, about what he stands for.
Set me up for later tonight when we're watching the results come in. If Raphael Warnock wins, what does that mean for for the rest of the country? If Herschel Walker wins, what does that mean for the rest of the country? What are the narratives that could come out of either result here?
If Senator Warnock wins, this really cements Georgia as a purple state, right? Because what you're going to see is you're going to have statewide Republicans, and you're also going to have two national Democrats when it comes to Senator Warnock and Senator Ossoff. If Herschel Walker wins, it really kind of takes you back to 2020 and 2021. But I think either way, regardless of how this night shapes up, Georgia will still be seen as a battleground state. We're still going to see voters looking at someone's policies, looking at what they stand for, rather than really paying so much attention to that big D or that big R next to someone's name.
Yeah, that is still a state election. I think that's a really important point that you make. All right, Laylee, Ipsa, they're in Georgia. Still. We'll see you soon, I hope.
Thanks, Brad.
When you describe a war between Ukraine and Russia, it can easily conjure images of equal responsibility on both sides. That's the image Russia wants you to see, despite the fact that this was an invasion. In recent weeks, of course, Ukraine has repelled Russian troops, but that's on Ukrainian turf. What we're seeing now, though, is something new. Attacks on Russian land that is undeniably Russian, has always been Russian, and it appears these attacks have come from Ukrainian drones. ABC's Patrick Reevel's been covering this conflict. Patrick, often I say you're near the front lines, but I'm wondering if the front lines have now moved to somewhere within Russia. What's happening here?
Hi, Brad. No, I mean, the front lines haven't moved, but this is quite remarkable because what we've seen is basically two bases suffered explosions, and both of these bases are located hundreds of miles deep inside Russia. What we know now is that from both the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, they've said that Ukrainian drones were able to hit these air bases that are home to the strategic bombers that are being used basically to try and destroy Ukraine's energy grid and that hit Ukrainian cities most days.
The strikes targeting something long thought untouchable, damaging two long-range nuclear-capable bombers.
When you see these waves of missiles, that's where usually these missiles are coming from bombers that take off from these bases. And, a key part of this war from the very beginning is that the Russians have basically felt that they can operate with impunity by launching these weapons from inside Russia, because the Ukrainians, for multiple reasons, have never tried to attack targets within Russia, and one of the reasons is simply that they've been discouraged from doing so by the United States, which fears that could escalate it into a wider conflict. And because of that, that's always given Russia a key advantage, because it means that it can launch these strikes basically with impunity into Ukraine. And so this really seems to change things, because it means suddenly that these bases that were considered untouchable are now potentially vulnerable to Ukrainian strikes.
And what kind of weapons are we talking about that Ukraine, are these are drones firing missiles, or what are they?
It's a good question, and we don't have great clarity on it. But what we know from the Russians is they called them Soviet-made drones. And essentially one of the things we've thought is that Ukraine wasn't able to reach these bases in the past, that simply it didn't have the weapons to do that. But what it seems to be, according to at least some Russian military journalists, they're suggesting that it was a Soviet-era drone, basically apparently very slow-moving type of drone, somehow managed to fly hundreds of miles across Russia without being intercepted. And I think that's the other thing that these strikes show, is it's an extraordinary failure from the Russians, because these bases are, major air bases for Russia. They're a crucial part also of its strategic nuclear forces. And so you'd expect them to be very heavily defended. And you certainly wouldn't expect Ukraine to be able to fly a drone hundreds of kilometers across Russia without it being intercepted. And that's exactly what seems to have happened. I mean, the Russians claim they intercepted it just as it arrived over the base. But even so, this is obviously an extraordinary thing to have happened.
Well, so I totally get the military strategy then from Ukraine's side. But politically, does this cause now problems for allies of Ukraine like the U.S. and President Biden, who have been telling the world for almost a year now, Ukraine's just defending itself? They're not being the aggressor here at all.
I think, firstly, the U.S. obviously isn't going to come out and say this is a great idea. But I think ultimately, when it's this almost type of covert attack, and one that's very much targeted against Russia's military infrastructure, I think there will be parts of the U.S. government that think this is actually a potentially legitimate target. And that's mainly because right now, Vladimir Putin's key strategy is to freeze Ukrainians.
This latest cruel attack that killed many people, injured many others, in an attempt to put Ukraine into the cold and dark, only makes Ukrainians more determined to work around the clock to prepare for winter.
So basically we see every week these huge missile barrages that come in and are destroying Ukraine's power grid. And until now, Russia's been able to do that with impunity. It's felt that it can just stand back and launch missiles. And even though Ukraine is winning on the battlefield, Russia thinks it can win by basically freezing Ukrainians and creating a humanitarian disaster. And what this shows is that Ukraine actually is not going to sit passively and allow that to happen, but instead is going to go after those same bombers that are launching those missiles.
Oh, like it makes you think twice before you send that next barrage of missiles into Ukraine.
Well, I think the Russians will absolutely continue to try and send these barrages in. We have already seen Russia send in a new wave of missiles. We saw it happen just hours after these attacks. Russia sent a barrage of over 70 missiles into Ukraine, again targeting the energy infrastructure.
Russia unleashing another deadly barrage of missiles across Ukraine. But Ukraine claiming it shot down more than 60 of the 70 missiles fired.
The Ukrainians in general think, that the Russians have thrown their worst at them, really. There is definitely a concern of escalation, of course, because ultimately these are part of Russia's nuclear forces. These bombers are nuclear capable. And so when the Kremlin suffers an embarrassment like this, it's under pressure from its most hardline supporters to respond in a very extreme way. And we have seen calls for that to happen. We've seen calls among ultranationalists saying that this is Russia's nuclear deterrent that is coming under attack, and they should respond in some way that underlines the severity of it.
Wow, and in a war with so many big moments that really define the whole thing, this another really big moment. All right, Patrick Reevell, thank you so much.
Thanks, Brad.
Okay, one last thing. Every year, top dictionaries name their word of the year. Last year, a lot of dictionaries selected vax or vaccine. In other years, it was Brexit or selfie. Words that really tell where you are as a society. Well, this year, perhaps in a sign of the times, the esteemed experts at Oxford English Dictionary did something they'd never tried before. They left the decision in the hands of internet voters. The experts expected a word like metaverse. That's very 2022. Instead, internet voters chose the phrase goblin mode. Which, if you don't know what that means, you're not alone.
Have you ever heard the word goblin mode?
I think so, but I'm not entirely sure.
What do you think it means?
It either means you're like a goblin, like in the mode of a goblin, or you're gobbling up food, like gobble gobble mode.
Honestly, not the worst guesses I've heard, but according to Oxford English Dictionary, goblin mode adjective should be used like this.
What are you doing this weekend? Goblin mode.
See, if you're going goblin mode, it means you're bundled up in your sweatsuit for the 4th day in a row, eating junk food, happily turning down invitations to go out with your friends. You've given up on being a person. You're a goblin now.
Your little brother is going goblin mode? What is goblin mode?
What's bizarre about this phrase is it was basically just made up this year. And I don't mean popularized. It was literally made up. This past February, Kanye West is part of the origin story of goblin mode, shocker. He broke up with the model and actress Julia Fox. A headline was circulated online quoting Fox saying Kanye didn't like it when she, quote, went goblin mode. The author later admitted that headline was doctored. Fox had said no such thing. It was just a prank. But by then it didn't matter. Young people had latched onto this phrase because it perfectly encapsulated what so many had experienced.
Just went like full goblin mode this summer.
In a moment where everyone's cajoling you to go out once again, to dress up, to be social, going goblin mode is a rejection of that offer. Oxford calls it being, quote, unapologetically self-indulgent, lazy, slovenly, or greedy, typically in a way that rejects social norms or expectations. And what's more 2022 than that? By the way, this was not close. Goblin mode won with 93% of the vote. Bodie McBoatface style. All these groups were encouraging each other to vote goblin mode. By the way, many thanks to Devin Dwyer and Michelle Franzen for filling in for me while I was doing my own goblin mode thing over this weekend. I'm Brad Milkey. See you tomorrow.
With so much at stake, so much on the line,